Everyone and good afternoon. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon from wherever you are joining us. I'm Maha Yahya. I'm the director of the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion around the Nakba and Retrospect. May 19th, as many of you know, marks the 75th anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba, which was a defining moment in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But also more critically, it resulted in the displacement and dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes and lands. More than 7 decades later, the legacy of the Nakba continues to shape realities on the ground, with Palestinians still facing and living displacement, violence, and systematic discrimination. Today also there are plenty of questions around the one-state versus two-state solution, the two-state solution which was agreed to in the Oslo Accords. To discuss this and much more, today I'm delighted to welcome to this panel discussion Marwan Muasher, our Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but also former Foreign Minister of Jordan and first Jordanian Minister to Israel and former Deputy Prime Minister, Nur Arafeh, a fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Middle East Center, where her work focuses on the political economy of the MENA region, and more specifically also the development security nexus and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Sarah Lee Whitson, who's a lawyer and the executive director of Democracy for the Arab World Now. She previously served as director for the Middle East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch. Last but not least, Omar Shakir, the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, where he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And he's been the author of several comments. This is a 1-hour discussion. For anybody who'd like to ask questions, please put them in the comment section, and one of our panelists will be able to engage with these questions. Marwan, let me begin with you. Could you talk to us a little bit about the Nakba, the 1948 Nakba, and what the consequences have been for Palestinians in particular, but also for the Middle East overall? 75 years after the 1948 war.
Thank you, Maha. I want to make several points here about the Nakba because the results of the Nakba are changing as we speak. In 1948, the Nakba meant the loss of historical Palestine, the forced expulsion of more than 750,000 people from their land. Just to recall that out of 900,000 Palestinians who were living in what is Israel today, beyond the Green Line, 750,000 left, were forcibly expelled, and only 150,000 stayed. What did that mean then? That meant that the Zionist dream was to establish a Jewish and a democratic state, democratic for its Jewish citizens, not for all its citizens, in historical Palestine, and treat those who left as second-class citizens at best. We look at the situation today and we see a vastly different demographic situation. Today, the number of Palestinians living in areas under Israel's control has mushroomed to 7.4 million, as opposed to 7.2 million Jewish Israelis or Israeli citizens who are non-Jewish and non-Arab. That means today that the Zionist dream of establishing an ethnically pure Jewish state and a democratic state is over, in my opinion. Particularly with the death of the two-state solution, we are faced with a situation in which Israel today is opposed to ending the occupation and establishing a two-state solution, which means it is going to be able to, or it thinks it can, rule over the Palestinians in what has become clearly an apartheid system. That word was taboo a few years ago. Today, it is becoming mainstream. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, many or UN, many other organizations are starting to call things as they are. Today, we have a one-state reality that is an apartheid reality. And this is where the conflict, 75 years, is moving. We are no longer talking about, the shape of a solution, while at the same time ignoring the rights of Palestinians living under occupation, as well as the rights of Palestinians who are today Israeli citizens. Today, I think the focus is shifting, particularly inside the occupied territories and the new Palestinian generation, towards talking about equal rights. In other words, whereas before we were talking about the shape of a solution first, and then worrying about rights later, today the conflict is shifting to talking about the need for a rights-based approach first, no matter what the shape of a solution is in the future. And that is where I think the conflict is moving today.
Thank you, Marwan. Nur, let me move to you and ask you, just having heard what Marwan said, and as a Palestinian who was living in Jerusalem at a certain moment, can you talk a little bit about what the Nakba meant and what you think of what Marwan has said?
Yeah, thank you, Maha, for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with you, Marwan, Omar, and Sarah. So as a Palestinian, it's the Nakba. I grew up hearing stories about the Nakba because my father's family, they were expelled from their house in the Ba'a neighborhood in the western part of Jerusalem. They became internally displaced in the eastern part of Jerusalem, where they are currently living. And my mother's family, they were displaced from Beit Dajan, and they lost all their farmlands. Specifically, they were planting orange. They had orange farmlands, and they were expelled to Ramallah. So I come from a family of internally displaced refugees. But for me, the Nakba, and here I want to draw on what Marwan was saying, is not simply an event. It's not a single event that happened in 1948, but it's an ongoing process of displacement and dispossession. And for me, it's rooted in Israel's settler colonial enterprise and this ideology that's grounded in Jewish supremacy and that has been seeking to displace the Palestinian people, expropriate their land, and completely erase them, including their history and their geography, in order to expand a society dominated by settlers. So I think it is this ideology that has been a driving force behind the Nakba and a driving force behind Israel's policies in Palestine at the moment. And what happened in Hawara just a couple of months ago is just the latest example of this ongoing Nakba, especially when Israel's finance minister Smotrich complained that state forces should be erasing Palestinian villages. So Palestinians are now going through, it's a very difficult period for Palestinians. And I completely agree with Marwan's analysis that what we have is actually a one-state reality. The two-state solution has been a great illusion since the very beginning. It's not a viable solution. And I don't know if it was ever a viable solution. And we know by simply looking at the reality on the ground and by looking at the map, which is now like a piece of Swiss cheese, whereby you have an archipelago made of Israeli settlements that are connected, coexisting with several enclaves which represent disconnected Palestinian cities, which are fragmented as a result of the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements, the building of the apartheid wall, and all the movement restrictions imposed by Israel. All this reality negates the viability of a two-state solution and shows us that it has so far been an empty rhetoric, actually, employed by or adopted by policymakers for lack, in my opinion, of a political will to think of an alternative.
Thank you, Nur. Omar, let me move to you now, having heard both Nur and Marwan. 2 years ago, Human Rights Watch released an extensive report called A Threshold Crossed, and which found that Israeli authorities are committing crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. You worked on this report. So can you talk us through a little bit some of the arguments there and why we would call Israeli occupation apartheid, and kind of, give us examples and walk us through that? We can't hear you, Omar.
Thank you very much. And let me just echo my thanks to the organizers for hosting this really important event. I think the starting point is to understand that in the 100 countries around the world where Human Rights Watch works, our methodology is to document facts, apply the law, and to reach conclusions based on our factual documentation. And that's exactly what we did here. We spent several years investigating Israel's treatment of Palestinians. So we did case studies across the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Israel proper, Gaza, comparing the treatment of Palestinian and Jewish Israeli communities, which are largely segregated. In addition to those case studies, we looked at 3 decades of Human Rights Watch's work across these areas. We put together statistics. We compared and analyzed trends. We looked at the work of Israeli, Palestinian NGOs, UN statistics. We then looked at the Israeli government's justifications for its policies, its policy planning documents, its statements by officials, its laws. And we put together this factual picture of the treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli government. And step 2 was to apply the law. So there is a term under international law for severe discriminatory oppression, and that term is apartheid. So while coined in relation to specific events in Southern Africa, major international treaties define apartheid as a universal legal term and as a crime against humanity. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, as well as the Apartheid Convention, in essence define apartheid when as a crime as really severe abuses when they take place in a context of systematic oppression by one group over another, and when there's an intent or policy to maintain that regime or system. So when we applied that legal definition to the facts we documented, the evidence was overwhelming. Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. That determination was based on us finding that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, the Israeli government has pursued a policy to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians, which largely manifests itself through the desire to maximize the land for Jewish Israelis and demographics. So maximum land, minimum Palestinians. And the report is replete with many examples of how this policy manifests, including explicit policies to Judaize the Negev, the Galilee. These are huge regions that make up the majority of land in Israel proper. Policies explicitly to Judaize Jerusalem, as well as long-term policies and settlements. Now, this intent has been combined with systematic oppression, whether we're talking in the West Bank about the imposition of dual legal regimes. So governing settlers who are living, settlements are violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention. They're war crimes. But yet these settlers are governed under Israeli civil law, while Palestinians are governed under a draconian military law. You also have, similar dynamics in East Jerusalem. You have the closure of Gaza, 16 years where Gaza has basically been run as an open air prison, nobody in, nobody out. And the last part of the analysis really was the inhumane acts, the severe abuses against Palestinians, the sweeping movement restrictions like the Gaza closure, like the hundreds of checkpoints, like the separation barrier built on Palestinian land, the permanent regime in the West Bank, the demolitions of Palestinian homes because Israel makes it nearly impossible for Palestinians to get building permits in large parts of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, whether it's the, mass expropriation of Palestinian land. We could go on, but the bottom line is our analysis, showed that the evidence was overwhelming that Israel was committing apartheid and crimes against humanity against Palestinians.
Thank you, Omar. I'll come back to you on some of these issues, especially with the newer policies that are being implemented. But Sarah, I want to turn to you now to talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel proper. I mean, we've seen increased tensions not only between the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and Israelis, but also between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis. A few years ago, the Knesset enacted the nation state law, which basically says, Israel is a Jewish state, and therefore all non-Jews are not considered second-class citizens, and it's been criticized as discriminatory legislation. So can you tell us, how can we best describe the conditions of human rights within Israel, without even touching on the current constitutional crisis in the country? We can't hear you, Sarah.
Sorry. I think it would be aptly described as a very, very bad human rights situation that has the protection of Israeli laws as cover for abuse and systematic repression, as Ahmad was just describing. But right now, on top of that, you have layered effectively what appear to be vigilante acts by settlers, by paramilitias, I think would be a more apt description of armed settlers who act with the protection of the Israeli military to rampage and raze Palestinian villages, to attack Palestinian protesters. There has been a shift of a new so-called civil administration militia under the control of the finance minister, which is also an effort to curb what little restrictions exist on Israeli policing, on the Israeli military within the West Bank. Of course, we've seen in the last 2 weeks renewed bombardment of Gaza, which took a number of civilian lives with the stated intent of targeting a generic category of terrorists. But because there has been some segments of armed resistance now within the West Bank in particular, I think we can expect to see much more regular incursions and killings of Palestinians, much more regular military actions by Israeli forces, both regular and irregular forces. And I think it's been aptly described as a powder keg.
Okay, can you describe to us a little bit more? So you're expecting more incursions by the Israelis against the Palestinians, but can you talk a little bit maybe also about the state of affairs for Palestinian or Arab Israelis? I mean, we've seen increased tensions there. As mentioned earlier, I mean, there's now a move or a legislation that's proposing to ban or threatens to imprison people for a year if should they carry a Palestinian flag. Can you describe to us a little bit more what's going on within Israel proper?
Well,
vis-a-vis?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have seen the stated platforms of Bibi's coalition, and that is to continue the expansion of laws that privilege Jewish Israelis and continue to sanction any efforts of political expression and organization by Palestinian citizens of Israel. The ban on displays of the Palestinian flag is one example, but there are many others. Expanded plans for building and construction in Jerusalem, continued confiscation and demolition of homes, and I think continued efforts to limit the funding and development of Palestinian cities, towns, and villages within Israel proper. I think it's just being done much more openly and much more transparently as a goal of Judaizing and maintaining the Jewish demographics, but also the power and privileges of Jews with a lot less apology. And I think we need to understand the efforts to squash the independence of the Israeli judiciary that the Netanyahu government is currently seeking, as very much related to efforts to remove whatever restrictions the court has imposed with respect to Palestinian rights, with respect to their rights as citizens, and to allow the government to make decisions that it would otherwise not be able to make because of getting tied up in courts. One other thing that's gotten less notice, but I think is important, is there's also been heightened repression against Palestinian prisoners who are within Israeli jails. The Israeli government has implemented some very draconian new measures specifically and exclusively for Palestinian prisoners. Banal but cruel acts, for example, limiting the ability of Palestinians to take a shower in prison for no more than 4 minutes, while Jewish Israeli prisoners do not have such restrictions, limiting the ability of Palestinian prisoners to have access to fresh bread, limiting their ability to have access to outdoor time, communications with the outside world, reading materials. That is a public and openly declared policy of increasing the severe conditions against Palestinian prisoners within Israel proper.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Nur, let me turn back to you. And you recently wrote a piece called Pacification Without a Political Horizon on why Israel's strategy to control the Palestinians is failing, and the kind of strong Palestinian pushback against it. Could you perhaps talk us through your argument there and why you think that the ways Israel is seeking to escape the situation will only make things worse?
Yeah, thank you, Maha. So basically in the article, I argue that since 1967, one of Israel's main goals has been to entrench its rule by managing and containing the Palestinian population, suppressing their political ambitions in order to ensure stabilization in the short run. So besides its use of lethal force against Palestinians, such as through targeted killings, housing demolitions, arrests, etc., Israel's system of control has relied on two other important methods. The first one consisted of employing pacification measures in the form of economic facilitations to co-opt Palestinians and manufacture their consent to Israel's rule in a way to ensure their political acquiescence. And the second method has involved relying on the Palestinian Authority to police its population and maintain stability on Israel's behalf in exchange for receiving benefits and rents. However, I highlight in the article that this strategy has been failing and will keep on failing because Palestinians will keep on resisting the Israeli occupation and will reject Israel's denial of their political aspirations. And the Palestinian Authority that Israel has relied on as a major instrument of control of the Palestinians is increasingly weak and lacks legitimacy in the eyes of the Palestinians. And so I argue that it's an untenable situation, and the only way forward would be to end Israel's system of injustice and its apartheid regime and fulfill Palestinians' longing for freedom, justice, and dignity. But in terms, Maha, of what would be required to convince Israel to change course, and I think that's an important question, I believe that Israel will be forced to put an end to its system of injustice when the costs of maintaining its regime are higher than the benefits. So far, this has not been the case, and the costs have been much lower than the benefits, because the occupation is relatively a cheap occupation, given the fact that since Oslo, the international community has been distributing a lot of donor money in the occupied Palestinian territories, essentially relieving Israel of much of its responsibility as an occupying power. And second, as I mentioned, the Palestinian Authority has largely acted as an institution of indirect rule that has been made responsible for ensuring Israel's security. And third, globally speaking, Israel has been enjoying a culture of impunity. So I think that when these conditions change in such a way that Israel is held accountable, no longer enjoys a culture of impunity, and when the costs of maintaining its regime of injustice are higher than the benefits, then Israel might be forced to change course. But I think, and here I want to build on the important work that's being done by Omar at Human Rights Watch and other organizations, I think there are certain developments unfolding at the global level that might affect, or that might be representing more growing challenges to Israel's regime. And one of them is the shift in the international perception of Israel and its depiction as an apartheid regime. I think this is significant, and the growing use of this framework in international arenas might prompt states in the future to put more pressure on Israel, but I think it will take some time.
Thanks, Nur. Marwan, let me come back to you on what has already been said in terms of the state of play in within Israel proper, within the Palestinian territories. But I also want to ask you, I don't know if you have a comment on what's already been said, but also I wanted to ask you whether we're looking at, there have been speculations that we're moving towards a third intifada. One which in this case will also involve Arab Israelis. Do you see that as the trajectory that we're moving along?
I believe we are already in a third intifada, Maha, in the at least occupied territories. Intifadas come about, Palestinian intifadas, when people lack any political horizon, when people feel that there is no end to their suffering and then there is no solution, in the horizon. But different from the first two intifadas, the first one was largely peaceful and under the leadership of the Palestinians inside the territories. The second one was largely violent and under the leadership of the PLO and the Palestinian National Authority. This one is violent but leaderless. And this is a natural, I think, extension and result of the lack of the international community to provide Palestinians with any hope that the occupation will end and they can establish their own state. Palestinians today, as Nur said, have little trust in their own government, which has been there for the last 16 years, 17 years without any elections. They have little trust in the international community, which so far has given them lip service about ending the occupation, particularly in the last 10 years, without any meaningful or even cosmetic peace process. There has been no negotiations, no process for the last 10 years. Only nominal and meaningless, frankly, adherence to a two-state solution that nobody is working towards achieving. And so Palestinians, and of course, they have no trust in Israel. And so the Palestinian youth today is moving to a situation where, they are exercising violence because of the lack of a horizon. And being leaderless, it is very difficult to deal with this phenomenon because you can't, there is no translation of this into a political process. Two, you don't know who to talk to anymore. Every 4 or 5 people are forming their own unit. And this is where the situation is today. I think that we are moving towards a phase where the young generation feels it has agency. It is not going to wait for the Arabs, for its own leadership, or for the international community to end the occupation. And they are taking matters in their own hands in a very complicated way.
Thank you, Marwan. Omar, let me turn to you, having heard what Marwan just said, particularly in terms of the kind of deadlock that we're seeing. There's been decades of failed negotiations, and as you've all said, many of us are arguing now that there's this whole two-state solution is pretty much dead. And yet parking the conflict or returning to the status quo would have serious implications for both Israelis and Palestinians. So my question to you is, what can the international community do to reverse negative trends that are cementing occupation and inequality while avoiding the failed policies of the past that have weakened both human rights in both Israel and Palestine?
So I think Human Rights Watch, for Human Rights Watch, we apply the same set of recommendations we do here for when we find crimes against humanity taking place elsewhere in the world. We found abuses of this scale in the treatment of the Rohingya in Myanmar and Uyghurs in China. So the report lays out very concrete recommendations around individual criminal liability. So at the International Criminal Court, in universal courts, targeted sanctions against those officials implicated in these crimes. We call for evaluating and ending all forms of complicity, including by businesses, by states, etc. But really, and this goes to your point, Mahan, the ones that others have raised, to get there, really the first step is we have to fundamentally reorient the way in which we talk about the situation on the ground. The entire discourse has been disconnected for far too long from the realities on the ground, right? A 56-year occupation is not temporary. Denying millions of Palestinians their fundamental rights solely because of who they are isn't simply a matter of an occupation that's gone on too long, right? A system methodically engineered to privilege one people over another, a daily reality of structural violence and repression, is not a conflict between two equal sides. A 30-plus year peace process, that's, let's be nice, stalled, moribund, doesn't exist, is not going to dismantle systematic oppression, right? Hagai Al-Ad, the executive director of B'Tselem, has said that democracy is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. The first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly, right? And I think we have to start with, as Marwan very eloquently put in the beginning, by calling a spade, by calling reality by what it is. I can tell you firsthand from the advocacy I've done at Human Rights Watch what a difference this makes. I mean, even advocacy I've been doing in Europe around abuses by the Palestinian Authority. The first thing that we say when we talk about this is, well, we need the PA for the peace process. And it's like suddenly the peace process has become this sort of barrier even to getting basic human rights advocacy, right? And the problem is that the discourse has been so driven by this idea that human rights abuse are merely, and again, Marwan said this in the beginning, are merely sort of symptoms of the problem, that the root cause is the lack of a political solution. We all want a political solution, but the root cause here is structural repression. So we need to focus less on what a solution might be and the problem that necessitates a solution, because every day that we don't do so, we're condemning more and more Palestinians to be born in Gaza without the right to move freely because of who they are, born in the West Bank without civil rights because of who they are, born in Israel with inferior legal status by law because of who they are, born in refugee camps for 75 years without the right to return to the country they're from because of who they are. So the first step has to be, let's call a spade a spade. Let's recognize the reality for what it is, and let's bring to bear the set of tools needed to end it.
Can I just follow up with you, Omar, on this? I mean, some have argued that the constitutional crisis we're seeing today in Israel cannot be delinked from its, the kind of policies and strategies, the structural and systematic repression and violence against Palestinians. What would your comment on that be? The constitutional crisis has been posed as a challenge to a democratic governance system in Israel.
Well, I think the first thing is to understand we're not talking about saving democracy, because democracy for one people is not democracy, right? I mean, that's something entirely, different, right? I think anytime there is grassroots movement pushing back against the government, that's something that, you generally support and look forward to. But I think part of the challenge we have here is that for a huge segment of those pushing back, they're just fine with reversing the clocks to 6 months ago. That reality would be enough to, sort of satisfy the concerns of the protest movement. And I think, there have been some cleavages, some breaks, there have been protests. I think earlier Hawara was mentioned. There were some Israeli protests saying, where were you in Hawara? There have been some that have been making the linkage. There's an anti-apartheid small segment of these protests. But I think ultimately, let's remember, the Israeli Supreme Court has signed off on almost all of these abuses. They've rubber stamped them, whether it's settlements, whether it's punitive home demolitions, whether it's collective punishment, whether it's use of force standards that allow the killing of Palestinians. I could go on and on for a lot longer. So I think it's important that we, understand these protest movements in the larger context of the repression of Palestinians, because ultimately that's going to be, the rubric with which they're tested. Now, is there a chance that this morphs into something that, more facially challenges and confronts the nature of structural repression? Possibly. But I think the discourse of saving democracy is simply, misguided, incorrect, right? The idea here is we need, if we're really concerned about a better future for Israelis and Palestinians, that the opposition has to be rooted, in confronting the system of, as Nur put it, supremacy, domination, that we've been seeing in place for decades now.
Maha, can I add to what Omar said? Because
yes, of course.
Omar is pointing out a very important issue, which is that what is happening in Israel today among Jewish Israelis is a call for equal rights for Jewish Israelis, and that there's a reason, of course, why the Arab Palestinian Israelis have not joined in these protests, is because, as Omar said, you cannot talk about equal rights while favoring only one segment of the population and not including the other segment. From now on, I think what has happened in Israel is going to point out, hopefully to the international community, the discrepancy, the double standard that Israel has today of demanding equal rights only when it comes to Jewish citizens. But even for its own citizens, Palestinian citizens, forget the Palestinians under occupation, for its own Palestinian citizens, that principle does not apply. Equal rights is only applied to Jewish Israelis, and that cannot be the case in the future. And so, maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, but I think that this shift to a rights-based approach is going to gain momentum in favor of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, because, as I said, it is simply hypocritical to talk about just equal rights for one segment of the population.
Thank you, Marwan. Sarah, I want to turn to you now if you want to comment on what's been said, but I also want to, because we were also talking about what the international community can do, I want to bring in the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh and ask you to comment on this is a U.S. citizen who was killed, brutally murdered while doing her job. So get you to comment also a bit about what has been done by that by the U.S. administration, and could more be done?
Yeah, so since the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, since really the apparent execution of Shireen Abu Akleh by Israeli forces, the Biden administration has tried desperately to say and do as little as possible. We observed them first claiming that they were going to investigate, but instead creating an investigation that merely relied on IDF and Palestinian Authority debriefings. We now know that there has been some kind of an investigation by the U.S. government, but the Biden administration is refusing to release the report. And we know that they are trying to edit the report on top of not releasing it. We know, based on Israeli sources, that the FBI has commenced some kind of an investigation and that they're refusing to cooperate. But the Biden administration has refused to say anything, even to acknowledge that there is such an investigation. I think that the hope and wish and goal of the Biden administration is that this will just all go away. And they are really just attempting to punt and weave and bob when Israeli abuses actually directly harm American citizens. Shireen Abu Akleh is not the only American who's been killed by Israelis. A 78-year-old Palestinian American was killed in Israeli custody after being handcuffed and left overnight in the cold by a very brutal and abusive Israeli military unit. Jamal Nisr was detained arbitrarily for 9 months by Israeli authorities. And I think what's interesting about his case, because he was recently released, is that the only reason I believe that he was released is because the State Department was threatening to actually take specific action on his case to list him as a hostage under the Levinson Act, something that my organization, Dawn, had been aggressively pushing for. And it was the threat of having Jamal Nisr designated as a hostage that actually produced some kind of reaction by the Israelis. I want to note, though, that he has not yet been allowed to return to the United States. So, the Biden administration wants very much to carry on with the pretense that there isn't a radical extremist, a terrorist idolizing government in place in Israel. They want to pretend very much that we aren't either amidst, as Marwan was saying, or imminently expecting a third intifada. They want to instead carry on with their campaign to, quote unquote, normalize Israel with the brutal, tyrannical governments of the Middle East. They want to hold a Negev forum and include Israel in the joint military defense of the region because that continues to be their goal, regardless of what developments take place on the ground in Israel and Palestine. And it's just like they are insisting to keep their blinders on and ignore what's happening. They sort of grudgingly, reluctantly have been forced to condemn some of the more, in the words of the State Department, disgusting comments by Israeli government officials, like the call to raise Hawara, and as well as some of the chants of protesters that had the sanction of the Israeli government yesterday against Arabs. But there has been absolutely no action or consequence to follow. I think the Biden administration instead wants to do everything it can to please AIPAC and pro-Israel lobbying groups ahead of the next presidential elections to assure them that the Democrats remain in their corner.
Thank you, Sarah. Marwan, let me turn back to you, and I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the Abraham Accords. We're seeing, there have been some press articles recently talking about the possibility, well, first, what the Abraham Accords have meant for Palestinians, but also it looks like a possible deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, an Abraham Accord between the two countries, is in the pipeline, potentially before the US elections, possibly before the end of this year. Can you talk a little bit about this and what this means for the
Well,
future?
I want to make a few points about the Abrahamic Accords, Maha. The first is that, of course, it is clear by now that they have nothing to do with peace. They were not, the word peace does not even exist in most of these agreements. They are bilateral agreements to further the interests of the countries who have signed them with Israel, but they've had no effect whatsoever on the peace process. They have not succeeded in moderating Israel's position. They have not succeeded in stopping the two wars on Gaza since they were signed. They did not succeed in preventing Ben Gvir and Smotrich and from the radical statements, etc. The Biden's administration's declared policy today about the Middle East, about the peace process, is simply to support the Abrahamic Accords, period. There is no other activity as far as the Arab-Israeli conflict is concerned by the Biden administration other than to support the Abrahamic Accords, and in their view, to get Saudi Arabia to sign them. That's the main prize for them. This is not to further the peace process forward. This is just to prove basically that peace is possible without having to talk to the Palestinians. And that's, of course, a fallacy. That's not going to work. There are pressures to include the Palestinians, for example, in the Negev meetings, and it's simply absurd to expect the occupied to talk to the occupier as if there is no occupation, and to start to talking about economic integration and economic. It has been tried several times in the past, by the way. I mean, Netanyahu in his earlier incarnation as Prime Minister of Israel has been calling for an economic peace to replace political peace. That's a fantasy. The record has shown that without progress on the peace front, without ending the occupation, all such talk is simply not going to succeed, in my view. And so, frankly, I give little attention to the Abrahamic Accords as far as the peace process is concerned. They are becoming, in my view, irrelevant. The Palestinians are not looking to the Arab world anymore to help them solve their problem. They feel that everybody has abandoned them, including Arab states, and they are taking matters into their own hands. So we can analyze the Abrahamic Accords from many angles, but certainly the peace angle should not be one of them.
On this note, Marwan, just as a follow-up, can I ask you what impact, if any, do you see the recent Saudi-Iranian rapprochement on the Palestinian question? I ask this because it's very clear that Iran has been growing closer to some of the Palestinian factions, particularly Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. There's been a reconnection, a reinvigoration of ties and support, etc. So are there any implications for this report?
It remains to be seen. I sincerely doubt that it will have much of an effect. I think that the Saudis reached this deal to diffuse tension with Iran, maybe certainly over Yemen, and certainly over its immediate neighborhood. Whether that means that the Iranians are going to pursue a different policy regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict or regarding their support for Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon, that has not been demonstrated in any way, and I doubt, frankly, that it will be demonstrated. I do expect the deal to result, hopefully, in a quicker agreement on Yemen. All parties want that. The Saudis want it, the Iranians want it, the international community want it. So that's the hanging fruit, and that is possible. But to expect Iran to pursue a different policy in the region just because of this deal, in my view, is highly doubtful.
Okay, Omar, let me turn to you with a question on international public opinion. I mean, we've seen the UN commemorate this week for the first time the Palestinians' 1948 flight from Israel, among other also first time commemorations, if you like. Would you say that international public opinion around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is changing in some ways, or is this more symbolism with little impact on the ground?
I think it's pretty undeniable that public opinion is changing. I think Nur referred to this earlier in her remarks. I mean, let's start with the fact that today, this didn't exist 3 years ago, there is a consensus in the human rights movement that Israel's treatment of Palestinians constitutes apartheid. It's not just Human Rights Watch, it's not just Amnesty, it's also Israeli civil society. 27 Israeli human rights groups, the day the new government came to power, used the term apartheid to describe the treatment of Palestinians. Of course, Palestinian human rights groups have been saying this for decades. Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic, UN experts, even beyond human rights organizations, right? You have former Israeli government officials, former attorney generals, deputy attorney generals, director generals of the foreign ministry, associations of 120 Israeli law professors, and globally, the former UN Secretary General, the French foreign minister, the Luxembourg foreign minister have all used the term apartheid to refer to the treatment of Palestinians. And even today's states, Maha, I mean, it's not just South Africa, Namibia, Indonesia, Malaysia, but at the Human Rights Council, we've seen the entire African bloc and the African Union, the entire Arab bloc and the OIC all also use the term apartheid. So really, we see this narrative having shifted, and that's significant. And survey data shows that it's not just at the level of at this level, it's also at public opinion, even in places like the United States, even among Jewish Americans, even among, Democrats, is shifting. Now, the challenge for us is that this shift is happening at the very same time we're seeing unprecedented repression of Palestinians on the ground. So the paradigm shift is not yet translating either in the halls of power in the US and key parts of the Western world, nor is it shifting the reality on the ground. So our challenge today is to take the shift that's taken place, continue to force people to deal with the reality for what it is, and then to translate that into actually dismantling and ending apartheid on the ground. So that's the challenge in front of us today.
Thank you, Omar. There's a question from the audience saying, it says it's by Orinier, and it says, by giving up on the prospect, indeed, the principle of a two-state solution, are you not undermining the long-time Palestinian struggle for sovereignty, independence, and statehood? Nur, let me ask you to take this question, and then if anybody else wants to comment on that, they're welcome.
Maha, your voice cut off. Can you just please repeat the question?
It's asking whether by giving up on the two-state solution, are you not undermining the long-time Palestinian struggle for sovereignty, independence, and statehood?
So that's a good question. Thank you for asking it. I think, no, I think the two-state solution, in my very humble opinion, was not a just solution to the Palestinians who lost more than 78% of their land after 1948 and the Nakba. And I firmly believe that the new, one of the solutions, like a rights-based approach that is currently being promoted, that Carnegie wrote a report about a couple of years ago, is the one that focuses the attention on the rights of Palestinians in terms of their longing for freedom, justice, and dignity. The form of the solution, I think, whether it's one state, two state, 5 states, has become a bit irrelevant for Palestinians, given the ongoing repression that they have been going through, given the sense of disillusionment and disgruntlement with the Palestinian Authority, and the sense of abandonment from the regional and the international community. So I think in the short run, a focus on just getting rid of the empty rhetoric about establishing a Palestinian state, because it's clearly not viable on the ground, and it's in contradiction with Israel's settler colonial enterprise that's rooted in the idea of ensuring Jewish supremacy. So I think we need to shift the whole framework and discourse. But, and this is something, another point I want to make, the rights-based approach is not the solution. I think it's a short-term solution to what can be done. But at the end of the day, yes, I think Palestinians will need a political end game that will guide their vision and strategy. But with the current lack of absence of a Palestinian leadership that lacks legitimacy and credibility in front of its own people, I think I think that's the way forward.
Maha, can I add to that?
Yeah, I was actually coming back to you, Marwan.
So
because
I may want to make 2 points to my friend Ori. I'm glad he's on this call. One, it is not a matter of giving up. This is the reality, whether we like it or not. So whether the Palestinians give up or not does not change the reality that we are living in a one-state reality. The question is, how do you ensure that this one-state reality is transformed to a democratic solution rather than to an apartheid solution? And there is nothing that prevents both communities, the Israelis as well as the Palestinians, from exercising their right to self-determination within a one-state framework. A one-state framework is not monolithic. There have been many solutions that have been put forward: a binational state, a federal arrangement. There are many solutions where both communities can exercise their right to self-determination and can have their own Palestinian or Israeli identity, but in a democratic state that is based on equal rights for both communities. And no matter what shape the solution takes form in the future, if it is not based on an equal rights framework or basis, it's not going to be sustainable. I think this has been made very clear, and this is the mistake that the international community, that we have all participated in, of focusing on a two-state solution that was not happening and ignoring for 30 years at least the rights of Palestinians. It's not just 30 years. I mean, of course, it's since the equal rights of Palestinians. But I say 30 years because of the Oslo process. This dream of arriving at a two-state solution has made us all ignore that there are daily violations of human rights for the Palestinians that can no longer be ignored today, no matter what the shape of the solution is going to take.
Perhaps we should add daily violations of human rights, political rights, civic rights, socioeconomic rights at every level.
Absolutely.
Marwan, you preempted my final question, which was going to be about the way forward. We started off looking 75 years back. Palestinians are still, more than 5 million Palestinians are still dispossessed, and it's only getting worse. So maybe I'll end with asking each of you to say a couple of words on the way forward, if you have something to add beyond what Marwan said. Let me start with you, Sarah. You're muted.
Perfectly timed after the comments of folks, which, I think reflects a desire to prioritize the human rights of Palestinians as individual human beings ahead of a political solution, which could be one state or two states or three states. So there's no abandonment. There's just a problem with sequencing. And to that end, what we are working on at Dawn, and hopefully we'll be publishing at a book, is attempting to fill a void right now about a blueprint of how Israel can transition into a rights-respecting state. We know there's a one-state reality. It's an apartheid, unjust reality. What's missing and lacking is a blueprint, a vision, a plan to replace Oslo as a plan, to demonstrate a proof of concept that it is possible to have Israel transition in a sensible, time-bound plan so that the conditions can exist for the people living in those lands to democratically decide how they want to organize themselves politically. I think that the absence of an alternative to Oslo, a detailed, articulated plan for Israel to transition out of apartheid and out of occupation, has become an effective means to keep us tethered to the carcass of the Oslo so-called two-state peace process. So I think that, let 100 plans bloom. But what we're missing now, where there's a void, is an actual plan or vision to replace the dead Oslo process and to occupy the space and narrative and thinking of policymakers to say that actually a solution is possible. Because the other fallback is just to throw up their hands and say, oh, well, we can't do anything. It's the Oslo, there's one state reality, we can't do anything. And we need to break out of that. I think we can do that with a new plan.
Omar?
I mean, I think Sarah Lee said it very well. I think the only point I would believe in is no matter, if you believe in peace and whatever solution, you want to get to, the first step has to be recognizing reality for what it is. We all know what it is. We need to call it out, because calling it out, building consensus around that is the way to start bringing to bear the sorts of human rights tools that haven't been there. And every day we don't do that is another day that Palestinians live a reality of repression. Let's call that for what it is, and we can move forward in whatever way is possible.
Nur?
Yeah, just to build on what has been said, I think Israel needs to be held accountable. The culture of impunity has to come to an end. And here citizens can play an important role in pressuring their governments to put more pressure on Israel and hold it accountable. And I just want to build on what Sarah was saying, which is, yes, it's important to focus on the principles of justice, equality, dignity, and freedom. But at the same time, we need a clear political end game. We need to agree on a larger political vision, and Palestinians need to organize their internal house.
Marwan?
The old Zionist dream of a Jewish and democratic state is over. The Oslo process is over. We are today living in a world that is increasingly focused on rights. And it's a word we have to acknowledge. The status quo is not sustainable, and the old paradigms have been exhausted. From now on, it is going to be a paradigm of rights, in my view. That doesn't guarantee us a solution anytime soon, but it is going to cause a shift of focus in the conflict that not everybody, is ready to accept, but that's, in my view, clearly where the conflict is heading. And I think that the solution, the future offers hope that if this is indeed the case, we might actually arrive at a solution in the future, this time that meets the requirements of both communities on an equal basis.
Thank you all very much for a very interesting discussion, sad on many fronts, but also a very interesting and I think lively discussion, specifically one that is trying to not only lament the past, but look forward and see what options there are for moving forward in a positive way. I'd like to thank you, Omar, Sarah Lee, Nur, and Marwan, and I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us, wherever you are, until the next episode. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maha.